Welcome, and thank you for joining me for today's exploration of the greatest American Old-World Tartarian homes, or houses, structures that people resided in. When we do these explorations, though, we see that these structures tend to look like amazing castles, such as this one, Beacon Towers, in Sands Point, New York. Built in the Shadow West style, but I'm going to call this the Gargamel Revival style. And I'm calling it the Gargamel Revival style because it seems as though we can just assign any name to these architectural styles. This was built in 1917 and 1918, 1 year, and they tore it down in 1945. Looking closer, we see the typical details of a castle structure, and it was built as a residence for Alva Belmont. She was the former spouse of William Vanderbilt, so those names you probably recognize. Very beautiful and amazing structure with many chimneys in this fairy tale tower. I even like the elongated windows on top of the tower. Why exactly does one need such a pretty tower? With the wonderful weather vanes, as we'll be told that they are on top of it. You've got to attract lightning. It couldn't possibly have another function. What is with all these chimneys and all these fireplaces? And you see the little balcony, and look at how long those windows are on the ground floor. Very incredible. And parapets. Perhaps Alva, who was the owner of the house, wanted to reenact a scene from the movie Deathstalker 3, when Deathstalker fought Troxardus. And now looking in the interior, and we see one of these beautiful fireplaces. Just an incredible structure, and we have to wonder how they built this in a year. Look at all the detail on the ceiling. And regardless of how the place is decorated, we can see that there was some real effort that went into the interior. Interesting note about Alva Belmont is she was a suffragist, and she lived in castles her entire life. She was born in a castle in Mobile, Alabama. You can see it yourself, or Mobile, I should say. Very, very pretty structure, and imagine having something like this to live in. We don't know why it was torn down in 1945. Moving on to the Bradbury Mansion, this is in Los Angeles, California, built in 1886, and demolished again for reasons unknown in 1929. Perhaps it had something to do with the start of the Great Depression, or maybe it was just unsafe, or passersby found that this house was very ugly. This does seem a little more house-like as opposed to castle-like, so we won't assign it the Gargamel Revival style sobriquet. Look at that amazing porch. Imagine having a porch like that with that kind of intricate detail as you go out into the front to take a look. And of course we have steps leading up to the door. Then the balcony with the oval window on the second, maybe third floor if we count the basement. Although I always thought every house in California didn't have a basement. And again we see many chimneys, beautiful towers, and ornate detail. Why do all these houses have to have ornate detail? Moving on to the C.M. Forbes home, this is in Portland, Oregon, built around 1887, we don't have an exact date, and demolished again in 1929. And more house-like, yet you see the pretty towers, you see all the ornate detail that goes up on the roof, and you have to wonder, how easy would this have been to actually build, especially in 1887? What was really the function of all this ornate detail? Was everyone just so ostentatious at that time? Anyone with money that they could afford to have this done? And then, of course, we had all these traveling workers that many people have theorized are all over the place. Now we go to New York, New York, and we look at the Charles M. Schwab House, built from 1902 to 1906, and then demolished in 1948. We're going to come back and take another look at this building later in the presentation, because it does bear a bit of a benchmark to compare the other houses to. Yes, calling this a house is one of life's great ironies. I think I'll call this Camelot Revival style. Very, very beautiful, and interestingly enough, built in an area of New York City where there were not intended to be houses. And if you look up the history of this particular building, you'll see the structure that's standing there now. Looking at the interior where we have these two very pretty staircases that meet, it really gives you the impression that there was a lot more going on with this building. And we have to wonder, questioning the historical narrative as we do, if this building was already there, what was its original intention and function? And we have to consider that with all these so-called houses or homes. Did they have a different intention or function when they were originally built? Because we just see all this beautiful, intricate detail on the inside. And you look at the entryway, look at this, with the ceiling. And what exactly does that symbol in the middle there mean? And we see the cherub angels. And how could anyone, why would anyone, even if you had this kind of wealth, want to put this sort of effort into showing this? What was really the purpose behind this? Now, of course, we know it's for the artistic inspiration to show what the true capabilities of humanity were. And now we go to Newport, Rhode Island, looking at the Chetwode Mansion, built in 1903 and destroyed by a fire in 1973. This may seem a little bit more modest compared to the other homes that we've looked at so far. However, you still see the rotunda with the columns under it, and you can tell that there's a little bit more to this house than meets the eye. Looking a little bit more house-like, although we could say it has the Roman Greco revival style, which might be more appropriate here, although I think we're given that name, so anytime we see a column or a pillar, we're going to think Greco-Roman. And now we go to the second Cliff House in San Francisco, California. One of the most incredible structures, given the fact that it's literally dangling over a cliff. This was the second one. Built in 1886, and it survived the very famous San Francisco earthquake in 1906, or General Funston's troops didn't get over there to set it on fire. Perhaps they were a little busy dealing with other things. And ironically, it was destroyed by a fire in 1907. So this very beautiful and very otherworldly house was only in existence for 11 years, according to the official narrative. This has come up in many explorations just because it's not only the structure, it's the location of the structure, which just defies simple explanation. Why would anyone want to build a house in this location? We have to wonder what's the real story behind it. What was this building originally? What function did it serve? And how was it constructed in such a pernicious location? And anyone's been to San Francisco, you're well aware of the winds, and there's the fire that finally destroyed it in 1907. Looks like we just have a party of gawkers. Oh, look, the house is on fire. I better get a picture. And don't you find it intriguing that someone just happened to be standing by in 1907 to get a picture of this house on fire? I'm sure it was all just coincidence and everyone was in place at the right time. What a tragedy, though. Such a beautiful structure. It survived the earthquake, and it survived all the actions taken after the earthquake, and yet it was still destroyed by a fire, barely a year later. Truly a pity and a great loss. Again, I wonder, what was the function of this building originally? I mean, could it have been that these incredible structures were used for residences? Perhaps. Yet we look on the inside, and it's difficult to find interior photos as this building was only around for 11 years, and we see the same ornate detail. And we have to wonder what exactly was going on if this group of people that were in this photo had found the structure and they inhabited it. What did they think of it? And did they really have any thoughts at all, or were they just there to party and enjoy while they could? And it's almost as though they knew they only had a limited duration of time before this structure would be moved on, or as it were, reduced to ashes. Now we go to the El Mirasol in Palm Beach, Florida. This was built in 1920, demolished in 1959. Interestingly enough, on the official historical accounts, there are numerous questions asking why this was demolished in 1959, and there doesn't seem to be a simple answer. And of course, we'll be told that this is some sort of Spanish or colonial revival style, although maybe I think something more appropriate might be Palm Beach revival style, since whenever you see a structure like this, you've got lots of palms around it. Now we go back to Chicago, or Shilaga, and this is the George Pullman Mansion, built in 1876 and demolished in 1922. The finest technology of 1876, and right after the Chicago fire, no less. And they managed to build an incredible residence like this, or so we're told. You know, we have so many different names for these buildings, structures, homes, houses, mansions, palaces, castles. All are appropriate. The intriguing thing about the George Pullman Mansion, though, is the fact that it's such an intricate and elaborate building, and yet it wasn't with us very long. We didn't even get 50 years out of it. Looking at the interior, you really have to ask that question. And on the interior, you see the small columns and pillars, you see the very beautiful, well-decorated ceiling, the floors. Imagine what it would have been like to live in such a structure. And as we go through on this exploration, I'd like you to think, which structure would you want to live in? Or what would be your favorite? And let me know in the comments. Because we see such amazing diversity and different styles, and we're told that's what people were trying at that time. And now we go to the La Ronda in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, built in 1929 and demolished in 2009. Now, this was one that survived a lot longer, yet somehow it was still demolished, despite the preservation efforts of many people in Pennsylvania. Very beautiful structure, and we see the parapets again in case someone wants to reenact the final duel scene from the famous movie Deathstalker 3. Look at the windows and the detail. Again, another clashing architectural style. The other interesting thing is when you consider the logistics behind all these clashing architectural styles for many of these structures that were built within the same 30-40 year period. Here's the interior of the La Ronda, and this is incredible. Here you really get the feeling of a castle hall. And yet with the arches on the ceiling, it kind of reminds me of many cathedrals that we see across the lands. Very beautiful, and we have to wonder, what else did we miss from the loss of this building? Now we go back to San Francisco, where we're going to look at the Mark Hopkins Mansion. This was built in 1875, and this did burn in the 1906 earthquake. So General Funston's troops perhaps got over to this one, and they had to burn it down to create a fire break. Look at the beauty in this structure built in 1875. And we'll zoom in on a trolley, because in the 21st century, trolleys are very San Francisco, but in the early 20th century, late 19th century, trolleys were found in every small town in the Midwest United States, and probably every single town and city across the lands. It's hard to say. But I always find it interesting how we think of trolleys as associated with San Francisco now. Back to the mansion itself. Look at this right here, the detail in what looks to be a dome structure almost, as part of a house. Built in 1875, or so we're told. We see elaborate windows, and I'm struggling to even come up with some sort of architectural name for a mansion or castle or palace like this. Perhaps you could help me out in the comments. And of course, we see the usual trappings of the fairy tale towers, so maybe we should call this fairy tale revival style, because this just seems very otherworldly, as though this is from a fantasy novel. Look at the roof on this, and the sloping nature of the roof, and here another tower with the windows on it. It's as though detail would create more detail, and just because you had a detailed tower, you had to add even more detail to it, such as we see with the many subsidiary towers that seem to hang off the main towers. And this is definitely not an architectural style you'll see today. Of course, you might have someone who will tell you this isn't very complicated. Of course, the real question is not whether it's complicated, but is it difficult? Here's the interior of the Mark Hopkins Mansion. And don't you find the detail in this very interesting? It almost gives a science fiction feeling to it. And I'm reminded how in the movie Blade Runner, director Ridley Scott used several old world buildings to great effect. This almost looks like this could be a set from the movie Blade Runner. Very beautiful arches and wonderful decoration. And again, we're not even talking about how the structure is furnished. And now we go to Topeka, Kansas. This is the Old Governor's Mansion. This was built in 1887 and demolished in 1965, no doubt with the urban renewal phase that swept the United States, or so we're told. And while this may seem a little bit more modest, we do see the elaborate detail here in a structure in the middle of Kansas. And also keep in mind that while this was built, they were working very diligently to complete the State House in Topeka, Kansas, which was architected by our favorite E. Townsend Mix from Milwaukee fame. Now we go to the Palmer Mansion in Chicago, Illinois. A very beautiful mansion, and watchers of this channel have seen the structure before. This was built in 1885 and demolished in 1950. And really, you get a castle vibe with this. This is definitely Camelot revival style. Look at this entryway with these little pillars and columns. And this goes back to the whole concept of scaling with all of these structural aspects that we see, and not just these houses, homes, castles, palaces, but also in the many government buildings and municipal buildings that we see. And here you have your tower with your parapets again, because apparently the wealthy like to reenact famous duels, and therefore they needed such things. I like the windows in the tower too. And look at the styling that you have with the different colored bricks. Also look at the small windows or arches that run off on the main tower. And yet another little subsidiary tower on the main tower. Again, as though there was no limitation on what detail they could add to these buildings. Imagine just being able to go out and say that you could design a home like this. Now, of course, we're told that these were very wealthy people. They had no limits, such as the aforementioned Alva Belmont. You look at all the houses she lived in. You look at her summer home, and she had an incredible summer home that looked like it was basically a small version of the White House. Look at this. When you look at where the windows are placed, and of course we see the very large foundation stones that are a hallmark of these older structures. It just defies the imagination what we see in these incredible buildings. And here's the interior of the Palmer Mansion. And look at this. This just defies simple explanation, and this goes back to seeing another film, Blade Runner, that perhaps they could have filmed scenes in this had this building survived beyond 1950 to the 1980s. This almost looks like this could have been the meeting room where Deckard met with Tyrell and they talked about the replicants. This could have been a very easy stand-in for Tyrell's house. And this was built in 1885. And yet to me, in 2023, this has a lot of futuristic and imagination to it. Now let's go back to the Charles M. Schwab house after looking at some more houses. And again, this is our quintessential castle, our Camelot Revival style as I'm calling it. What I find fascinating is that this was built in only 4 years, 1902 to 1906. So consider that. And you can look up plenty of mansions that are currently under construction all across the lands, and I want to ask you how many of them are only done in 4 years. Now, looking closer, we see the elaborate detail with the entryway. You have to have towers on your entryway, as if, other towers aren't enough. The interesting thing about Charles M. Schwab is that supposedly he died nearly penniless because he was a risk taker when it came to his finances, and when the market crash hit in 1929, he didn't come off so well. The tragedy is he had offered this incredible edifice as a residence for the mayor in New York City. But the reform-minded mayor, we're told by the official narrative, LaGuardia, did not find this house meeting his standards. Now, for what reason that was he trying to appeal to the people as being someone common? I don't know. But as a result of that decision, this amazing structure, house, castle, mansion, whatever you want to call it, was demolished, unfortunately, in 1948. And we only have these images to appreciate it. We see the many details on every single window and the many different fireplaces that always seem to be present on these buildings, as though they were struggling to keep them warm, but we have to wonder if they had a different function. And here's another interior view of the Charles M. Schwab house. And just look at the detail in the sitting room. You see it on the ceiling, on the walls. In 4 years, no matter how much money you had, how were they able to do all of this in 4 years? And I'm sure people in the comments might have some ideas that it's not that complicated. It can be done if you just have enough money and no limitations. Still, I'm in awe of the detail that you see here. And you talk to people who are into finishing, and they'll tell you it's not exactly an easy matter, no matter how much time you have. Now we go to White Marsh Hall in Windmore, Pennsylvania. This was built in 1921 and demolished in 1980, so this one lasted a little bit longer. And here we see the classic stylings of what will be told are Roman Greco revival or American democracy revival in the 19th century, with the typical columns and the triangular construction. Here's an interior photo, and here you actually have columns on the inside with this elaborate staircase. Again, this is another building I'd love to see construction photos, especially of the foundation and the interior, which always seem to be lacking. If anybody has anything, or if they have more information on any of these structures, please share in the comments. I would certainly like to look in more detail on each of these. This is an overview to see if there is interest in further more detailed explorations of these various structures, homes or houses. Don't you find it amazing that these were homes or houses? And now we go to the William A. Clark House in New York, New York. And this was built in 1897 to 1911. So they do tell us that this beauty took 14 years to build. Unfortunately, it was demolished in 1927. So 14 years to build, and it was only around for 16 years. And we have to wonder what the story on this one was. And look at the beautiful tower. And there's more detail that seems to have gone into this one than some of the others. And what kind of style would you call this? American science fiction revival? I have no idea. I'm open in the comments. But you just look at all the arches that go into the tower itself, along with the many chimneys, and again, it seems like we're looking at something from another world, another time. It's very difficult to pinpoint exactly what they were going for in this kind of detail. And we're told it's clashing architectural styles, and there were no logistical considerations in this group of traveling workers that were going all around the nation that the mainstream narrative will tell us. Apparently they could build all of these clashing styles, whether it was Romanesque revival, Chateauesque, or whatever, or Gargamel revival style. I'm going to see if there's another one that's Gargamel revival style. Look at that with the detail on the windows and looking closer to the ground, and then you see that ground window over there where you have the little arch with the different stones. And here's an interior of the William A. Clark House, and now we're almost expecting it. Beautiful ornate detail on the ceiling and the walls, and a very well adorned fireplace. Because what else would you have? It still blows my mind that all the effort that went into building this, and it was only around for 16 years. No one wanted to preserve this. No one could think of another function or use for this incredible building. Nope, tear it down. We need our block apartment housing that's at a very cost-effective rate for our residents of New York. And now, I just want to show you, going back to the Paris Bel Air mansion. This cost $75 million, and this is modern day. This is what $75 million will get you now. Now, after all these structures that we just looked at, how much does this mansion really stand out to you? Let's look at the interior. So, the story that we seem to be getting doing this comparison is that even if you are wealthy now, you really can't get anything that compares to what was in the past. This just seems so very modest. $75 million. That's what this will get you now. Does this compare to all these structures that we just looked at? Is this the story that we're willing to believe? Because we always say it's a matter of money. Well, how much money did the Hiltons need to spend to get a house like we just saw? What's the greatest old world house of America? Well, by virtue of it being the only survivor, the Biltmore Estate, or the Biltmore House or Mansion in Asheville, North Carolina. You can still go visit this beauty today, and it's considered a tourist attraction and yet another amazing wedding venue in Asheville, North Carolina. Built for George Washington Vanderbilt II between 1889 and 1895. Only 6 years to build this beauty, and they say it's one of the prominent examples of Gilded-Age mansions. I don't know what you would call this, what actual style would fit. Now they say it's Chateauesque, the same as the first structure we looked at, Beacon Towers. However, I think there needs to be a special name for this. Perhaps they should call this Imperial Revival style, or Imperial Citadel Revival style. Of course, we do have construction photos with this one, although we have the usual slew of questions that come up with this incredible house, where we have individuals just standing around and we have very level construction. You can see some of the archways and you have to wonder. On this one, you can see the example with some of the bricks. Why is it the bricks towards the foundation look like they're already old? I don't know. I mean, maybe these construction photos are good enough, and maybe they prove that this was really constructed, as they said, towards the end of the 19th century. But I wonder. I wonder about the Biltmore Estate. And maybe not the best interior photo here, but I just wanted to give you the idea that you see the same details. The same details with the ceiling, the fireplace, and just the gorgeous arrangement of everything within this incredible house itself. I've had the pleasure of visiting this estate a couple times, and here's an overarching view of the dining room, and look at that fireplace with that kind of detail. And also look at the ceiling. I don't know. It's very difficult for me to believe that this was built as we're told. There's a lot of detail to the Biltmore, and I wanted to introduce it in this video as the example of the best of our old world houses that we took a look at, because it still survives to this day. I'd also like to see in the comments if there's interest in doing an exploration video focused on just the Biltmore. I've gotten a couple requests for it, but I want to see what your feelings are. Here's the ballroom, a very modest ballroom at the Biltmore. And you look at the floor and the detail on the ceiling and the arches, and here's another construction photo. Now, I pulled this one out because apparently in mid-construction, George Vanderbilt took a group of guests to tour the area during construction in 1893. Why exactly would he do this? I mean, we know that George Vanderbilt had many structures, many mansions, many houses, many castles all across the nation. Was it just that neat to go see a construction site that he would delay construction just to take a little group to tour it? Very interesting story. And again, we have the same questions about this construction photo. Well, as always, ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. Thank you for joining me for today's exploration, and again, in the comments, let me know which one was your favorite. Please like, comment, and subscribe.